Good, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, wherever you are. We are thrilled that you're able to join us today for what we hope will be a very rich and engaging discussion. And we appreciate you giving us your time. We have a full agenda, so I'll do a brief introduction to get us started. This is part of a series that we are conducting that focuses a lot on the rural principles and how we learn more about different pillars within the OECD rural principles. Just a few housekeeping bits to get us started. One, this meeting will be recorded. Um, if you have so that if you want to watch it again or share it, you're welcome to do that. Two, the chat is open and engaged. We encourage you to use the chat. We're going to ask each speaker after you've spoken just to spend a bit of time in the chat to answer any questions. If you have questions for a particular speaker, just put their first name in the chat and then ask your question. And each speaker, we ask you to pay a particular attention there so that you can be responsive. We'd like this to be very interactive. Also, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you are and how these issues are, what's your perspective on these issues, because we want to learn not just from our speakers, but we also want to learn from you because all of you are experts in your field in different ways. So with that in mind, let's get started. I wanted to at least share. So could you go to the next slide, please? So this is part of a series, as I mentioned. So we have another one on the 22nd that's going to focus on rural discontent. We have one on measuring well-being and looking more specifically at those aspects. We're going to be doing a discussion on rural, urban, and agriculture, and also one that looks at how to apply futures and foresight. We'll also be sharing a bit more next year, the list, but obviously stay in touch with us if you'd like to stay engaged and learn more about the discussion. And perhaps this is a good time to bring Delphine's PowerPoint online. And maybe I'm always pleased to introduce my colleagues. And Delphine has been kind of leading our work on inequalities. She's a policy analyst and has been doing this for a number of years. And the Regional Outlook released last year had some really important messages that I think frame very well the discussion that we want to have, because it really pointed to some key areas that are challenging for OECD member countries that we need to address. So the floor is yours, Delphine.
Thanks, Petian. Hello to everyone. It's a pleasure to participate in this conversation on rural development. And indeed, I'll try with this presentation on regional inequalities to offer some insights on the key trends we observe across OECD countries based on the analysis from a report we published last year, as Bedian mentioned, which is our OECD Regional Outlook 2023. If we can go to the next slide. So I propose that my presentation basically covers two parts. First, as I was saying, to present you with some of the trends in regional inequalities that we observe in OECD countries, and actually taking a look back over the last 20 years of how they've evolved. In the second part of the presentation, and I'd also like to highlight, why these persistent inequalities across OECD countries need to be addressed with an adequate and actually integrated policy roadmap, which resonate with the topic of the conversation today, especially at a time where we know a number of global transitions, such as climate or demographic change, could further amplify these divides. So maybe to start with this slide, with an overview of how regional inequalities have evolved in OECD countries over the past 2 decades. So maybe just to preface by clarifying that in this report and in many of the slides that I'll be showing, we look at inequalities at the level of what we call small regions. So it's the OECD sort of statistical nomenclature. They correspond to départements, cantons in France to counties in the US, for instance, which we find are an interesting unit of analysis because they are really closer to the geography where people live and work. And what we did is that we compiled 20 years of GDP per capita data across 27 OECD countries to paint a more granular picture of how these inequalities have evolved. And what we see is that generally across the OECD, globalization has translated into several decades of economic convergence between countries, but the same cannot be said of what we observe within countries, where in fact large regional income inequalities have prevailed. So you can see that in many countries like France, the United Kingdom, the US, Italy, and many also in Eastern Europe, income per capita in the richest 20% of regions is more than twice that of the 20% poorest. And this gap go as high as 3 times in Turkey, the Slovak Republic, and Poland. And even in the countries that have seemingly small gap, like New Zealand and Japan on the right-hand side, income per capita in the richest regions are in fact 40% higher than in the poorest. So in the next slide, we want to show that this story is actually not that simple. And there is a diverse evolution of regional income inequalities across countries. So we've tried to group countries in different by different types of trajectories. So for instance, starting at the top right, you can see several high-income countries where regional income inequalities have widened over the past 20 years. So that's a group that includes France, the UK, the United States, Belgium, Japan, Denmark, and Sweden. Below this, we have a group of countries that have converged towards the OECD average GDP per capita, but they have seen regional inequalities increase, and that includes many of East European countries. Now, on the left-hand side, we have countries where regional inequalities have narrowed. But for some, it happened in a context of relatively weak economic growth. So that's the case of countries like Greece, Portugal, and Spain, where richer regions, in fact, have been sort of underperforming. And so we've seen a leveling down dynamic. But for other countries, they've sustained relatively high levels of GDP per capita, or they've converged towards the OECD average. And at the same time, they've succeeded in narrowing regional inequalities. And that include countries like Finland, Germany, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, but also Korea and Turkey. But we know each of these countries has a different story and the different set of factors behind these trends. And I'll be going into more of those details. So in the next slides. So what lies behind these trends of how regional inequalities have evolved? Well, we see that in many countries, this trend is largely due to the dominant metropolitan regions pulling ahead. Differences in GDP per capita between large metropolitan regions and other regions account for the largest share of regional income inequality in most OECD countries. So it's the results primarily of agglomeration effects. So on the left-hand side, you can see that population growth has been much faster in metropolitan regions. So in fact, the largest metropolitan regions grew twice as much as non-metropolitan regions. And these same large metropolitan regions are also pulling away from other regions in terms of GDP growth. And that's the right hand chart. Today, on average, metropolitan regions across the OECD have around 32% higher GDP per capita than other regions. If we go into the next slide. So while metropolitan regions are growing, many other places are actually losing population, especially remote regions. Over the last 2 decades, we've observed that nearly 40% of these regions in the OECD shrunk. They're also actually aging. They have the highest share of old age dependency ratios above 50%. But shrinking is also a problem for mid-sized metropolitan regions, which you can see in light purple. 21% of them saw their population decline over the last 2 decades. And in many regions, they will continue to shrink in the next decades, which you can see in the right-hand side with risks, in terms of local public revenues, the cost of maintaining public services and infrastructure, but also their elections. So in the next slide, so what we look also in the report is the fact that the geography of inequality stretches beyond economic outcomes. In terms of education, for instance, we see that the share of adults with tertiary education is much larger in cities than in rural areas in all OECD countries, with a gap as high as over 25 percentage points in Hungary and the Slovak Republic. And this gap has been increasing in three-quarters of countries in the last decades. Why? Well, because we see that highly educated workers tend to move to cities, but also because it's difficult to access quality education early in life and to attract good teachers in rural regions. The OECD PISA studies, for instance, shows that in 2020, students in city schools obtained higher reading scores in all OECD countries, but the UK and Korea. And in the next slide, you can see that this geography of inequalities is also relates also to digital infrastructure with quite a striking urban-rural divide. We see that on average across OECD countries, a third of households in rural areas do not have access to high-speed broadband. And these gaps tend to reduce opportunities for rural areas, including from remote working, but also telemedicine, for instance. And overall, these spatial disparities, which we observe in education, in broadband access, as I just mentioned, but in other dimensions of well-being, including health, are all connected. When public services and infrastructure are of poor quality, it's then harder for lagging regions to attract and retain the people, the skills, and the investment they need to break this sort of vicious cycle of decline. So the question arises of should we leave these spatial inequalities unchecked? Well, we've been looking a bit at the cost of inaction, and what we see is that these costs may be too high to ignore, and that's what I like to cover in the second part of my presentation. So if we can move to the next slide and the next. So what we see is that persistent inequalities raise a number of costs, starting with economic costs, because we know the contribution of lagging regions to national economies is sizable in aggregate terms. We see that persistent inequalities also raise social costs because they undermine social mobility and they also lead to a higher welfare dependency. And they have political costs that are becoming more and more visible because they risk deepening what has been called as the geography of discontent. You can see here on this chart large gaps in trust in government across regions. And I understand that Joanne will go further into this issue later on in the discussion. We see that regions in long-term economic decline or high unemployment often exhibit lower levels of trust in government. But it's also true in regions where people feel they have lower standards of public services than in other regions. Next slide, please. So as we look forward, we know the previous one. Thank you. There is a risk that the digital and green transition could further widen these regional inequalities. So I mentioned already, that we see gaps in digital infrastructure that may leave non-metropolitan regions behind. But in the green transition too, the prospects of differ quite sharply across regions, with lagging regions the ones tending to lose out. Because metropolitan regions have higher share of green jobs, especially capital cities, because these green jobs are concentrated in high-skilled professions like research, architecture, and engineering. And while we might expect rural areas, of course, to benefit from investment in renewable energies, these activities tend to be highly automated and creating few jobs. So you can see on the map also that the share of polluting job is highly concentrated in some regions. In the next slide. So I want to finish with this slide, to discuss a bit what can we do against this backdrop. And there are definitely policy levers, on the table. And what we've tried to do is come up with a policy roadmap that provides an integrated approach to boosting performance in all types of regions so that they can benefit from the transformations, the global transition dimension, but also strengthen their resilience. There is no silver bullet, of course, but these five complementary or integrated priorities, which you see on the screen, can be a way forward. The first priority that we put here is to ensure access to key public services, both online and in person. And that requires ensuring, timely and easy access to high quality services. Sorry, providing access to high quality services require, attracting and retaining skilled public service professionals, especially in rural and remote areas. And we see, for instance, the example in Australia of the workforce incentive program that provides financial support to doctors and to nurses who work in underserved remote areas. The second important priority that we outline in this roadmap is boosting productivity and competitiveness, including through better infrastructure. And here, the example of the United States is interesting, especially the Reconnect program that has made $700 million available in grants and loans to connect thousands of rural residents, farmers, and business owners to reliable, affordable, high-speed internet. Korea also has made very large investments over recent years and has managed to bridge the gap between rural and urban areas when it comes to access to high-speed internet. The third important priority is providing the right skills and job opportunities in regional labor markets. Of course, also improving the quality of multi-level governance systems, facilitating the collaboration and cooperation of governments at different levels in their policy actions. And fifth, strengthening capacity at both national and subnational levels with, again, interesting practices and experience across OECD countries. I'll stop here. I hope that provides food for thought also for further discussing how these different policy priorities can be tailored to the key challenges of rural areas. So many thanks.
Thank you so much, Delphine. I appreciate that first framing the conversation, and I encourage you to ask Delphine questions. And Delphine, please keep an eye on the chat for any questions specific to your presentation, because I think it's relevant. I want to turn now to the WHO and to Theodora, because I think it provides another important context for the importance of taking a more integrated approach. I have the privilege and pleasure of working with Theodora on a number of different initiatives. She is the senior technical lead and unit head over in the Director General's office of the WHO. So Theodora, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So yes, I will be speaking about integrated rural development planning from a sector-specific viewpoint, and that is health. Next slide, please. I have three key messages in the presentation today. The first is that rural development planning influences health. The second is that health sector planning influences rural development. And the third is that rural proofing across sectoral domains, including in the health sector, facilitates integrated rural development planning. I'll now start by focusing specifically on the first message, rural development planning influences health. Next slide. So the foundational frameworks on the social and environmental determinants of health that you're seeing in this slide, they really emphasize that the health sector alone is not the only sector with a responsibility towards health. And so in the context of integrated rural development planning, you can see how a range of other sectors are actually influencing health, whether they be agriculture and food production, education, social protection, water and sanitation, housing. These are all essential to health outcomes. Next slide. What I'll do now in the slides that come is I will unpack with specific examples some of the links between health and rural development. And for some of these examples, I will be drawing on the One Health framing. One Health is an integrated, unifying approach that aims to sustainably balance and optimize the health of people, animals, and ecosystems. It really stresses the linkages and interdependency across these. It involves multiple sectors, disciplines, and communities. Next slide. So now let's come to my example number 1 in terms of how rural development influences health. And I want to look at topsoil and desertification processes in particular. We know from some of the emerging data, including that published by our FAO colleagues, that 90% of the Earth's topsoil is at risk by 2050. So this will have a direct implication on health in terms of its impact on food systems, on availability, accessibility of healthy and nutritious food for consumption. But also through topsoil's roles in things like carbon capture and things like preventing desertification processes and preventing floods, there will be other important health implications. Next slide, please. The next example I'd like to focus on relates to pollinators, again, under the umbrella of the One Health approach. There is really important emerging research on the implications in terms of pollinator loss on human health. And I'm showing here a study that was released by Harvard that looked at the potential impact of inadequate pollination on excess deaths annually. Carrying through with some projections there with 4 different scenarios. And that same study looked at the impact of inadequate pollination on crop production and the livelihoods of rural communities. So again, there with this example, I'm drawing out the links between rural development advanced by different sectors and implications for health. Next slide. I'd like to now just briefly touch on 3 additional examples. Can you click forward? The first is broadband, and indeed that was covered by the presenter before me, Delphine, and she talked about lower broadband coverage in rural areas and how important this is for things like digital health, telemedicine. Next. Thank you. Also, with regards to water, in terms of availability through small water supplies in rural areas is quite important, but small water supplies such as wells also have a greater potential for getting contaminated, thus impacting health. And here is another area where intersectoral action is quite important for ensuring the health of rural communities. Can you click again? And then also aging, as mentioned by Delphine as well, rural areas in many countries experience higher levels of population aging than urban areas. We know in the decades to come that we are expecting a much greater percent of the world to be age 60 and above. And so how rural communities through strong social sectors, how they really age-proof, that is very important. And so that will also require enhanced collaboration across the social sectors as well, really ensuring that health is embedded within that. Next slide. So now I'd like to come to the second message. Health sector planning influences rural development. Next. Here, we know from our work on universal health coverage that people living in rural settings globally and the poorest households experience less coverage of essential health services than national averages, and hiring impoverishing health expenditure. Through our work on health workforce in rural areas, we know around 2 billion rural people are without adequate access to essential health services in their communities. So access to essential services is really fundamental to ensure that rural communities are attractive. They're places where young families want to, have their children, where they can access antenatal care, where their children can then be taken care of. So there's an important role that the health sector has in ensuring that rural communities are places where people want and can live. Next slide. And through our work on strengthening the rural health workforce, we see that the efforts to actually strengthen the health sector are intrinsically linked to other sectoral domains. So this concept of integrated rural development planning is quite important. One of the recommendations that we've highlighted in our work is linked to improving the living conditions in rural and remote areas, and the role of municipalities and other sectors in this through housing allocations or through enabling broadband and transport, adequate broadband and transport coverage. These are all factors that feed into this, improving also working conditions through enabling access to ongoing education across the life course for health professionals. This again shows the importance of intersectoral action. And one of the key recommendations that came forward was locating health worker educational facilities closer to rural areas, and also enrolling students with a rural background in health worker education programs, really showing the importance of collaboration between health and education. Next slide. And particularly on that point of collaboration between health and education for improving rural health workforce issues, I wanted to just highlight a specific meeting that was held under the umbrella of the EU Rural Pact Support Office. It focused on enhancing access to health services in rural areas. And one of the key emerging recommendations was particularly on young students, and it called for decentralized models of education. And this, again, will be critical for rural pipelines where rural youth are engaged as health workers to serve their communities, offering important employment opportunities for them. Next slide. The health sector has an impact on rural economies, and just with the example I gave on how rural youth can then become health workers and serve their communities, this has an important multiplier effect in terms of labor markets. For example, for every 100,000 spent on the health system, work by WHO in terms of estimating the economic and social impacts and benefits of health systems, shows that 4 new jobs are created in the rest of the economy. The work also looked not only at the labor market multiplier effect, but also more broadly on the economic multiplier effect, where 1 additional euro spent on products and services in the health sector would result in 1.4 euros of greater output in the national economy and 2.7 euros of greater output in the national economy when you include the induced effects. So although that analysis didn't specifically look at rural, it's important to take into account when considering regional economies. Next slide. Now I'm going to come to my third message. Rural proofing across sectoral domains, including health, facilitates integrated rural development planning. Next. So we are very grateful for the collaboration that we've had with OECD, European Commission, Rural Wonka, and other partners around the rural proofing space. We are referring to it in our work on health as a systematic application of a rural lens across policies, programs, and initiatives to ensure that they are adequately accounting for the needs, context, and opportunities of rural areas. And so through a range of multi-sectoral events, when we're bringing together rural development authorities together with health sector authorities, we've been unpacking what does this mean for health sector policymaking? What does it mean for our data systems? What does it mean for financing? And then also, how can we actually encourage a mix of bottom-up and top-down approaches that are really enhancing the voice of rural communities throughout the process? And we have done a series of events, as I mentioned, but we're also now working on a global research project. We have a forthcoming workshop in Limerick in Ireland, actually a WHO technical report that will include case studies. Our partners in WHO Regional Office for Europe have also been working with SRUC on an additional report. And then we have pieces of research being featured in this special edition on rural proofing in rural and remote health. Next slide. All of this is linked to our wider collaboration with OECD that really looks at rural proofing in the context of bridging the silos between the rural development and health sector stakeholders. And that is also focusing on capacity building, on providing the guidance across sectors, on improving the data and evidence and approaches towards translating that evidence into policy making required, and then country support. Next. This is my last slide. I just wanted to finish with is saying that we are advancing work now together with the Uganda Center for Rural Health and Stellenbosch University, the European Commission, as well as with inputs from OECD and the Rural Working Party of WANCA, for a course that looks at health in the context of integrated rural development planning. And the course will cover social determinants of rural health, environmental determinants of health, rural health service delivery, rural health workforce, and governance with regards to rural proofing, financing, and social participation. Thank you, Betty Ann, for the chance to be with you all today. Back over to you.
I have to say it's really impressive that my speakers are staying to time. I anticipated losing time, but they're actually doing quite well. Thank you so much. I wanted to just emphasize that Delphine made the point about inequalities that is contributing to a wider gap between rural and metro and non-metro regions. Theodora made the point of how the connection doing rural development policy by itself is not enough because it bridges so many different parts of government. But the question you'll probably have, and the question that is continues to be a problem, is how. How is it? How do you work? How do you break down silos? How do you work across government? And so I'm pleased to bring the next speaker on. And maybe you can bring up his PowerPoints, James Johnson, because he does a great job of thinking about how to break down silos. And I thought this was the great moment to bring him in. And please, any questions you have for Theodore, use the chat. I mean, what do you think about working across government? How difficult is it for you from the prism where you sit? Share it in the chat and let's start a conversation. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Betty Ann. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm James Johnson. I'm one of the directors at Lighthouse Policy Design. And for the next 10 minutes or so, trying to keep to time, I'm going to be talking about mastering those silos, a perfect setup. Let's have the first slide, please. I'll just tell you a little bit about Lighthouse first. We sit at the center of two quite big silos, the whole world of policy formation, with policymakers mainly in the United Kingdom, academics, etc., the ones with the sort of big ideas and big plans. You sit between that world and the world of policy execution, the teams working to build products and services and policies and legislation to really render those policy ideas in real life. So we sit at the center of these two worlds, bridging the gap between the two. Next slide, I'll show you a little bit about what we do in a nutshell, just so you can kind of get a feel for it. We do a bit of portfolio thinking, similar to the roadmap that we saw earlier, to really help leaders in policy pick the right policy initiatives for the problems they're trying to solve and really kind of get the right strategies and roadmaps in place for their particular policy area. We do policy sprints, which is like deep dives into specific initiatives to really get under the skin of a very particular idea or initiative and really, do feasibility, viability sort of studies on those things before big money is invested in them. And then finally, we do bridging the gap training, essentially building the capability of delivery teams to work with policy and also demystifying delivery for policymakers as well. So that operational disconnect doesn't pose a huge risk for the success of policy initiatives. Next slide, please. I was asked to speak here today after Betty Ann spotted this blog post that I wrote 5 years ago. And I was challenging at the time the idea that silos are inherently a bad thing. So I've got an unpopular opinion that silos are actually not a bad thing. And as Theodora was saying, the key mainly is in the bridging. So next slide, please. I want to just give you a bit of a scenario. Heaven forbid you would ever be in this position, but imagine you're having a medical emergency or somebody who's around you right now is having one. Who do you want to show up when you call for help? Who do you want to pick up the phone when you call for help? Of course, you want the paramedics turning up. You want the trained professionals with the equipment and the expertise to help you right away. You wouldn't want the planning department answering the phone or the waste disposal guys turning up at the door. Even if they're eager to assist, they don't have the tools and the skills or the knowledge needed to handle a medical emergency. And this example is just a silly example, but to try and point to something quite fundamental, that silos exist for a good reason. They preserve the specialization that we need to address specific challenges effectively and efficiently. And in moments of need, having distinct teams with concentrated expertise is critical for getting the right help. Next slide, please. So I think, unpopular opinion is that silos are good. They allow organizations to build depth, to focus on their domain, and to develop real expertise. Next slide, please. So, as Theodore was saying, that we need, instead of breaking silos down, the right way to look at this is to build connections between them. So the real power lies in connecting silos and enabling each to contribute its unique strengths towards a coordinated solution. And then when we connect silos, we amplify their impact. So each team or department brings its own depth of knowledge, and together they create solutions that are more comprehensive and effective than any one silo could ever achieve alone. So as I say, instead of trying to break silos down, what I always try and focus on is bridging the gap between them, connecting them to create links that make collaboration easier, more natural, and ultimately more effective. Next slide, please, because the key question is, how do you do that? So how do we bridge this gap between two parties or two entities? Often people look at this as quite passively, like they're looking for a massive structural change or a new committee to be established. But I don't think that's the effective way of doing it, or that's certainly not the only way. My way of looking at this is that it starts with each of us individually. It's about each of us taking personal responsibility to reach across silos, learn from other departments, and find ways to work together. So I wanted to share 3 practical ideas I found useful that might give you some ideas of your own, just things that we can take into our own ways of doing things that kind of help us bridge these connections rather than waiting for somebody else to come and fix it. If we're waiting for structural change to fix this problem, we're going to be waiting a long time. So next slide, people, we'll get into some of the hows. And these are maybe sound really simple, but they're really powerful. The first thing is about curiosity. So curiosity is one of the most powerful tools that we have to bridge divide. It's something we can all do. It's easy to assume that we understand the work of other organizations and other teams, but often they have unique pressures, priorities, and constraints that are invisible from the outside to us when we're on the outside. So by making it a habit to ask questions when you have the chance and take a genuine interest in the challenges other teams face, that starts to build more empathy. And empathy is obviously the key ingredient for any meaningful collaboration. The curiosity builds empathy, and that leads to collaboration. So a simple way to start is to, next time you're in a meeting with somebody from a different department or team, kind of genuinely ask them how the issue looks from their perspective and listen to the answer. What are their team's key priorities? What are their biggest hurdles and hopes and fears? And just those small acts of curiosity, if we actually take time to listen to the answer, that can often be the spark that leads to more informed, productive interactions across silos. Next slide, please. So the second idea is just building connections through small, regular interactions. So these tasks of building connections across silos doesn't have to mean big events or big meetings. In fact, some of those effective bridge building happens through small, consistent actions. So in other words, collaboration is more likely when people feel comfortable with each other and reaching out to each other. And that comfort comes from familiarity. So if you can set yourself a goal to reach out to somebody in a different department you're trying to work with once a month, even if it's just for a quick coffee or a 10-minute conversation, ideally it wants to be kind of deeper than that, but to start with, the consistency is the key. And those regular informal conversations help to build trust and open lines of communication that make future collaboration easier. It's less about one big gesture and more about creating small, ongoing opportunities for dialogue. When we dialed in, somebody dialed into this meeting initially and was like, "Oh, it's great to see you. I've not seen you for a long time." Like, there's clearly a relationship there that's been built up in the past that makes that conversation so much easier than it would be with me, who's a complete stranger. So, kind of things like that really do start to bridge the gap between individuals across the divide. And the next slide, please. The third thing, again, nothing groundbreaking, is working in the open to make things better. So another way to bridge silos is by being transparent and open with what you know and what you're doing. Often silos stay isolated because people don't feel comfortable sharing information beyond their own department. As this event today is showing, sharing knowledge, even informally, even not through these kind of things, but even informally, can create mutual understanding, respect, trust. And thinking of ways to make your own team's work accessible to others is really a valuable thing for you to spend time doing. If you're working on a project that might overlap with another team's area, let them know about it. If you're working on something like the inequality presentation we saw earlier, share it, and you can kind of other people see it, and that sort of transparency breaks down barriers and can also reveal unexpected areas of synergy. Next slide, please. I'm going to show you an example of kind of how I sort of an example of me doing this. Really, this going back to this blog post again. The image you can see there is a research synthesis board. So I was having real trouble a few years ago connecting with policy colleagues. My background's in more design and delivery world, so I'm trying to connect with policy colleagues. I'm really struggling with it. The work I do is quite innovative to policymakers, and a lot of them don't really get it. So after kind of doing the wrong thing for a while, which was kind of trying to like really influence them by repeating myself, I decided to take my own advice really and be more curious. So I had 73 conversations with different policymakers from across government to really try and understand more about their lives. And this image here was me trying to process what I was hearing from these people. Different, often conflicting feedback, but massively useful in terms of me getting to understand the people I'm trying to influence. Next slide, please. The main insight, if I could distill it in 5 words, was this: that great minds don't think alike. So policymakers are high achievers. They're well-educated, extremely clever, and well-trained. But they're not all the same. And that was my lazy assumption initially, that in the early days, kind of treating people all the same and like a homogenous block. So my learning point here was that these people are different. Now, I wanted to help my teams benefit from this learning. So I took the research and created 7 archetypes. So 7 mindsets that were evident in my research and could be used more practically to help build better connection with policy people as a starting point, just to get a bit lower, scratch the surface on the stereotypes of policymakers. I was going to show them to you now, see if they resonate. So next slide, we'll do this quite quickly. There's a couple of mindsets that are in the change bias. So there's the visionary and innovator. Visionary is really ambitious, big picture thinker, motivated by potential. And the innovator, they're an experimenter. They thrive on creativity and seeking out new ideas, new solutions. You find these in policy teams occasionally. Next slide, please. The next group of mindsets are in the efficiency bias, where we've got the operator, who are all about reliability, low-cost, practical solutions, navigates the bureaucracy really well, kind of good operator in the civil service, and the pragmatist, who are all about efficiency and delivering tangible results. They can sometimes be seen as short-sighted or narrow. And next slide, 3 more, was in the protection bias. So the guardian's protecting vulnerable groups. The collaborator is protecting sort of inclusivity and relationships, making sure everyone's involved in the conversation at the right time. And the veteran, they respect protocol and tradition and favour proven methods. They can be seen by people new to policy as a dinosaur, but really important part of the policy framework. So that was just an example of a way that I did that, used those insights to kind of start to build bridges between my team, the work I do, and the policy team I'm trying to influence. This is a foundation of our training that we're doing, that bridging the gap training I was telling you about. Next slide, please. Now with the penultimate slide. Just picture a bridge. I was trying to say there was that this is how we start to try and bridge that gap between the two, is to at least kind of build more empathy and understanding of each other's roles. Penultimate slide, sorry, last slide, final slide is just a big lighthouse brand. That's me done. Hopefully that was of some use, and hopefully I didn't go over time, Betty Ann, but hopefully that was of some interest to you all. Thank you so much. I'll look at the chat now if there are any questions or anything.
Please, ask James. I thought those were really good examples, and I would challenge the chat to see which one of those categories you work with the best. Probably you have a few of those, you know them well. Now I wanted to switch over to the pragmatic and introduce someone, Lillian Salerno, who is currently the acting Deputy Undersecretary for Rural Development in the United States, to kind of give you some practical examples of how they try to bridge the gap and work with silos or bring silos together. And I have to say, she also had the privilege of working for her for a number of years. So I'm quite familiar with her, and I'm excited to see you again in a different role. The floor is yours, Lillian.
Thank you. Thank you, Betty Ann, and thank you to your team. Really, really happy to be here. Let's see. This is just, go to the next slide, please. I'm just talking about a priority framework, and you all are probably aware that in the United States, we have a changing of the guard. And so what I'm speaking about are about the priorities of the current administration and how we were challenged on how we make our priorities across a very big bloated federal agency. So just for you all that aren't familiar with rural development and why it's sort of stuck on the back end of the United States Department of Agriculture, we're basically like a bank. We're about a $220 billion bank, which sounds like a lot of money because it is, but that's not that we put $220 billion into just grants and technical assistance. The majority of that money is basically guaranteed loans, right? So for the rural part of the United States, which is pretty massive, they don't have the same access to funding and capital that the urban areas do. And so this was set up many years ago, and sort of a conglomeration of different agencies coming together, and basically for the rural areas of the country, this bank was our way of making sure that the rural communities were there to support sort of the agricultural communities. And that includes water, energy, housing, telecommunications, lots of things that are very expensive. And most recently, broadband, which has been pretty much the most exciting stuff that we've done. One of the most exciting things that we've done in this administration is really tackling broadband. And none of us are sure that would have happened had it not been for the COVID pandemic, because up until then, there was a pretty universal truth in the United States that, if you can't pay for it, we're not going there. And those last miles of broadband, which you all are probably well aware, are, don't get funded unless somebody mandates that they do. So it's been an expensive project. So that's basically just a background on the rural development mission area. And then the second slide, please. Basically, for us, there was not really, how do we get this for a big federal agency with thousands of employees across a bunch of different states? How do we make sure that people aren't having to do a one-off on how to utilize our priorities? So our team came up with sort of a policy priority framework based on the 3 priorities from the Biden-Harris administration, by giving priority points, by using sort of the indexes that one could use universally, so that we could give points so that we could get to those hard to reach areas that have sort of been left behind in the U.S., which most of you are aware happen in the southern part of the United States, and then in our tribal communities across the U.S. And so it's been pretty transformative transformative and also pretty exciting to see as much money that we spent and invested that has actually gone into these areas. And when I had the privilege of working with Betty Ann 8 years ago, we were trying this back then also to see, how we could do more for those with less. And it was just always these one-offs. And so this was a way for us to establish our priority framework. And that's what this presentation is mostly on. So go to the next slide, please. So our three key priorities for the RD mission area for this administration were addressing climate change and environmental justice, advancing racial justice and place-based equity and what we call community place-based equity, ensuring all rural residents have equitable access to RD-funded projects, and then creating more and better market opportunities, making sure that small business and small ag entrepreneurs in the rural part of the country were given some, not as much as some of the big guys that own most of the agricultural business in the U.S., but certainly give them a way to be sustainable as ag producers. And so we worked really hard on that. And how do you do that when you have 50 different states and 50 different decision makers in those states deciding who gets the money? And this was our way of articulating that the priorities are done universally and using the same indexes for that. Next slide, please. So the description of the priorities were key. What are we trying to accomplish? How do we see who qualifies? And using some just general indices that we didn't have to invent about, who's socially vulnerable, income-based, and then how to use priority points. For us, we have 70 different programs, a bunch of different decision makers, complicated, we're not easy to access. How do we make sure that someone in the Delta region of the United States and Mississippi has the same access to somebody in Vermont, for example? And so we use priority points. So and that's usually income-based and some indexes that I'm sure you all are familiar with. Next slide, please. So for climate change and environmental justice, we use the disadvantaged community list and the disadvantaged community and energy community. It's a map. This all runs out of what we call our Rural Innovation Center within USDA that has just done a really good job of making sure that we have consistent data that people can, put on give to individual stakeholders and say, let's dig deep and make sure that these communities are being addressed. On our racial justice and place-based equity, we've had things called Rural Partners Network and other mandates to try to work more in a universal fashion through the federal government to ensure all rural residents have equitable access to our RD programs. With that, we use the social vulnerability index map and equity community list based on this social vulnerability, and then on the more and better market opportunities, which is our way to assist rural communities to recover economically. We use distressed community index list. Next slide, please. And these are integrated into our existing processes. We, use funding notices, regulation planning, regulations, outreach and engagement, and we try to make sure that those are universally applied. And we weren't sure that, we could pull some of this off. And actually, when we're looking at the numbers, it seems that we got a lot of it right. We probably could do better, but at least people know that we're attempting to make it a universal, adaptation of the agency to try to accomplish these three priorities. And we were pretty unsuccessful up until this time doing that in a universal way. Next slide, please. So just for, our investments, it looks like a lot of money because a lot of it's loan money and it is a lot of money, but a lot of that has to do with all the legislation and the money that funded after what we call the the IRA, which is basically, we didn't call it, but it had a lot to do with the climate change. And for addressing climate change and environmental justice for our investments, we were able to hit, 23% of that money going into the indexes that we had set, which is pretty remarkable. For advancing racial justice and place-based equity and opportunity, for the amount of money that we were putting in, that's here in the billions, we were able to put, 18%. Still a long way to go, right? And creating more and better markets for the investments. And remember, these aren't all grants. A lot of these are secured loans on, $2 billion clean energy projects. And these are also investments given to businesses in the US, which we call cooperatives, which are the electric co-ops. So these are big. This is a lot of fiber in the ground and materials, not necessarily into healthcare centers and childcare centers, right? So there's a lot of infrastructure, which is what the IRA was or is, hopefully. Those investments went to distressed, vulnerable communities. And so that was good work. That was good work. Next slide, please. Also working with our sister agencies and our federal government. We're a bunch of independent agencies that have had a history of not talking very much. Sorry about that. Haven't had a history of talking together. When Betty Ann and I got to work together, we at that time called it promise zones, where we promised to alleviate poverty in areas that were generationally poor. And that was some of the first work that was done, at least with our agency at the Department of Agriculture, where we were looking to reach across to all the federal agencies and force us to work together than having our poor communities have to look up 15 different email addresses and 15 different numbers to get us to come and talk to them about the technical assistance they needed to apply for any of our programs. So this is the group that we've been working with. A lot of the money has been sitting in with the Inflation Reduction Act, sits with the Department of Energy and the Department of Commerce. And then, of course, a lot of that money comes through our Department of Treasury through tax incentives for people to do climate reduction type of work. Next slide, please. So the clean energy investments through the Inflation Reduction Act, we received about $12 billion. The other U.S. and government agencies received a lot more. Ours is targeted, of course, we only deal in areas of less than 50,000 person populations. So a lot of commingling of money was needed in order to get certainly on energy and utility providers to utilize our money. A lot of this was, huge, big forgivable loans to try to get people to, come off of coal, for example. But again, we couldn't do that in a way that made sense unless we had set up the priority points at the onset. And so all of this money that went out under the Inflation Reduction Act, it was all part of us building the plane while we were flying it, right? Because all this was new money under the Biden administration, and we were on a mad dash to get out all of that money before January 20th. And that's certainly, we're very thankful that we, someone, not me, had some really good thinking about, if we're going to do this, we have to do it at a scale that everybody gets treated equally, that they know where the indexes that we're using, that we've all agreed on them, and it has worked to a large degree. The broadband piece has been just, shocking. I would have never thought. I come from a small town in Texas where I never thought that the group that I grew up with would ever get broadband. When I could visit family, you just didn't get it. But they are getting, and we don't see it yet. But I mean, we hope the money's out the door and a lot of the money's in the ground, and we hope that that will continue because without broadband, of course, these rural communities really, really are up against overwhelming challenges. Next slide, please. Oh, that's me. I really, really appreciate being able to speak about this way that we looked at it from USDA rural development in order to make sure that we were able to implement this historic amount of money and not just put it out in the same way. We were very strategic about it, and we were hoping that it pays off. So I'm really happy that I was invited to speak, Betty Ann, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Lillian. I appreciate you taking the time. I know how busy things are in this moment. If you have any questions for Lillian, I encourage you to use the chat and put her name so she can see it. Lillian will stay for a few minutes just so she can answer any questions. And of course, if she has to dash, we will forward any questions on to her. I want to bring now into the conversation maybe Maria Martos Perez. She's also going to give another kind of example of creating a network of territorial innovation centers, spaces to promote more kind of cross-government working. So Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Betty, and hello everyone, and a warm welcome to all attendees. I'm really happy to be here. In this presentation, we want to briefly present the strategic objectives of the Territorial Innovation Centers, CITs, like space to promote the creation of development of activities in rural areas in Spain. Next slide, please. Thank you. CIT are part of the strategic plan of the General Secretariat for the Demographic Challenge to face the population. They are an instrument within the 130 measures of the national plan to address the demographic challenge aligned with the Recovery, Transformation and Resilience Plan. Exist three of these plans called Development and Innovation of the Territory addresses the development of a network of these territorial innovation centers. The objectives are to improve the country's territorial rehabilitation and eliminate the urban-rural divide and promote action in areas most affected by inequality. Sorry, next slide. Okay. Sorry, I was confused about the slide. Yes. You can go back the first. Okay, the previous slide. Thank you. What is a CIT? CIT are provincial and multi-provincial strategic spaces that promote collaborative ecosystems to reactivate rural territories, as I said before. They aim to act from the territory, strengthen and accompany the initiatives already revitalizing the rural environment and promote the talent of our towns. Its objective is to achieve territorial balance through economic development, talent, requirement, and innovation. If we can move the next slide, I'm sorry, the next one. Okay, about location, we have currently 11 centers in different provinces of Spain. They are Asturias, Badajoz, Cáceres, Cuenca, Huesca, Jaén, León, Lleida, Soria, Teruel, and Baleares in the north. CITs are located in strategic areas with a risk of the population with less than 5,000 inhabitants per square kilometer. Other territories will soon be incorporated into this network. Next slide, please. Thank you. What do we want to achieve? Enhance existing projects. We want to implement innovative initiatives, and we need to reinforce a concept of rurality based on collaboration, collective intelligence, and social innovation. The main objectives could be energizing the rural and socioeconomic fabric. Second, work for demographic challenges, supporting existing agents in the territory. Third, improving the quality of life. Also retaining and attracting talent, and at the same time developing entrepreneurship, and finally seeking territorial balance. Next, please. How are CIT organized? The core of the CIT strategy is people and their relationship. The idea is to work together, as I said before, collaboratively to revitalize the territories and that they are being depopulated. The organization is horizontal and inclusive. Local public entities, civil society actors, and business associations participate. They are focused in strengthening relationships and teamwork to, as I said before, energize rural territories. Please, the next slide. CIT networks is coordinating and his coordinating node began operating recently in July 2024. Its task is to connect each of the provincial innovation centers. This coordination office depends on the General Secretariat for the Demographic Challenge. It's located in Ponferrada, in León. Its objectives are coordinate and promote innovative projects, encourage the creation of synergies between the different territorial centers, and to be a facilitator of good practices, changes, and successful experiences. And finally, they promote collective innovation and transformation solutions to activate sustainable economic development through the territory. Please, we can move to the next slide. the structure of this network and its main node office operate in two levels. First, the node reinforces the coordination of initiatives and communication between each of the provincial CITs. And second, the General Secretariat for the Demographic Challenge catalyze the various initiatives launched by the different ministries to face the demographic challenge. So the main points are coordination, catalyst for initiatives, a digital platform, and the final objective is to promote connectivity, visibility, and appreciation of rural life. If you want to get more information, you can see these points that you can see in the slide. And I think that is all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Maria. I think what you can take from the previous two presentations are two different ways of trying to be a bit more integrated in how we approach working on rural issues, and you see also the diversity of the actions. What I wanted to do is to give you a brief introduction to a topic that was kind of introduced by Theodora earlier and is kind of infused within a lot of this discussion today, and it's about kind of rural proofing, and I kind of retitled my presentation rural proofing and how we can support an integrated approach to rural development. So I will do my best to keep on time. So maybe just to give you a brief introduction, again, thanking the WHO for their collaboration. Theodora had this slide up earlier. This kind of work comes out of some a collaboration with WHO, where we looked first at some lessons from countries that are working with rural proofing, and then kind of focused a bit on health. You will have the slides after if you choose to. You can click on the link to see the report. But maybe just really quickly, I wanted to kind of tee up this idea of rural proofing, because I think the speakers that are following behind me will go in more in depth in different ways on the ideas within this concept. I think it's worth looking at what is rural proofing and how we see it, because it's talked about a lot, but do we really understand what it is and the sentiments behind it? And I find that there are two emotions that it brings up. It brings up love, and it also brings up hate, right? It's this idea that, you know, people love it or hate it, but it's happening. It's whether you know it or not, the idea of going towards balanced development, what does that mean? Means where rural areas are being maybe affected by policies, there's an imbalance in the effect. You are rural proofing when you're trying to address that. So whether you're calling it rural proofing or you're calling it something else, there is an element happening where work is being done to try to support rural communities in this space. It is really about reviewing policies, right? But it's not a policy itself. And it's important for that to be remembered. It's a process, or, you know, a policy support resource, if you want to call it that. And I like to say, and it has a number of different names. It's rural lens, it's island proofing, it's territorial proofing, it has an indigenous proofing. You know, it's the idea of what is a policy, what is the potential impact of a policy, and if it could be negative, how do we help to get some information on the table to ensure that it's not negative, right? And that is happening, it's growing. So the idea is when you can rural proof, you are enabling the decision makers, whatever they look like, whatever level of government, to be a bit more informed about what could happen if the policy is taken forward. How does it really work? it really is about three pillars. It's really kind of the underlying pieces that are being discussed here. It's about gathering evidence, it's involving stakeholders, and it's delivering information, right? But how is that done in a clear, concise, and timely fashion? And if you think about it as a process, that is what it looks like. You're gathering evidence. I like to call it rural proofing intelligence. You are involving stakeholders, experts, advisors, government officials, and you're delivering information that is flexible, concise, timely, and able at a moment to inform the decision making at any level of governance. Why? Because as Theodore said earlier, it's very difficult when you're talking about rural development to do rural development without working across government. We didn't collaborate on this, but I'm introducing this slide to really just encapsulate what Theodore said earlier. These are the different departments that directly and indirectly affect rural health. Now we could take out rural health and put education, we could put climate change, we could put environment, and see how much different ministerial departments, government agencies have to be thinking about rural. What's important is that they probably don't think about rural, and that's where that rural proofing piece comes in. At the core of all of this, and the paper goes into a lot more, is the evidence. What are you using to kind of help folks to think about rural, especially departments that don't think rural, right? They need the best evidence available to them so that they can understand potential impact. I like to call that rural proofing intelligence, right? It's made up of a combination of different factors. You can add as you wish, but it at the baseline has three different pieces to it, right? What we call state of rural data, potential impact data, and rural added value data. One being very broad, and the other two are much narrower, and also at the same time could be case studies, could be presented in different ways. But the better we get at that rural proofing intelligence, the better we get at helping the policies become more balanced in the space for rural. Now, again, this is not about what's in it, but just the questions are natural. What do you mean about the data? And so state of the rural data, as one example pulled from the UK, is a compilation of data pieces that really give you a state of rural, transport, housing, health, etc. What's going on in rural is state of rural data. Because remember, your audience, when you're thinking about agencies outside rural, are agencies that don't naturally think about rural the same way that a Department of Rural or a regional ministry may be thinking about rural already. Impact data, it's really about what are those actions, what are those policy actions, what are the potential impact on rural, and what's the evidence of that potential impact. Harder to do, but very relevant. And then the value added piece is equally important because it's thinking more about what are the benefits of working with rural. And this goes to a larger conversation about how you are portraying rural and what's your rural narrative. If you see rural as areas of opportunity, how can working with rural communities, meaning designing a policy that's co-designed with rural communities, could help deliver better health systems in rural areas, education systems in rural areas, reach your climate agenda goals, achieve just transition, etc. It's the value added of working with rural communities. This is relevant to this conversation because it's really about how rural proofing can help you be more integrated. If you understand that it relies on evidence, then you're working with different groups of people, stakeholders, to help you build that evidence. So if you think about it across three pillars, you're working with your experts, your institutions to help build a rural proofing intelligence, right? To help design the story, to help change the narrative of rural, to help position rural as places of opportunity that we work with that are equal partners at the table, to improve and to build the capacity and the knowledge in rural areas. Then you have your citizens, you have your stakeholders, you have the people who live, breathe, and work in rural areas who can help to fine tune that knowledge, who can bring the people to that information, who can help to support the development of tools and help to support by citizen engagement practices, workshops, being involved that can help them buy in and manage expectations about policies. So it's as much about your experts, your strategists, but then people. And also it's about the rule proofer, the person who is looking at the policy, your government officials. And I don't know if my colleague William Parnell is here, but this is something that I know he speaks a lot about, which is, who is that rule proofer? And how do you make sure that you're designing for him? And he's usually a civil servant. He's your government official. He's the person who at the end of the day has to be responding to the information and using it. And he's overburdened, he's overworked, and he has a lot going on. So how are you delivering this information to him? And how is he co-designing this with you? How are you bringing him into your citizen engagement strategies or your expert advisory groups? It's about a combination of factors. And so that rural proofing element is very relevant because when you're applying these processes, you're actually enabling a more integrated approach to your rural development strategies. So I'll stop there and share maybe the paper talks about 10 different ways to get rural proofing to strengthen it. That can be another discussion, but I wanted to give that quick kind of overview as an entry point to bring in my other colleagues, and I'll stop sharing now. Particularly first, Paul Lavive, who is in the department based in the Canadian government, and he's going to talk to us about leveraging a more place-based approach to rural and regional economic development, which kind of picks up some of these pillars. So Paul, the floor is yours. And again, feel free to talk in the chat and to kind of maybe challenge some of these notions, or maybe talk about how much you love or don't love rural proofing. Paul, the floor is yours.
Betty Ann, thank you very much. And I'll just say that I'm honored to be here today to share information about Canada's integrated approach to rural economic development. I love that introduction because you're gonna see a lot of what you're talking about with rural proofing as I work my way through the presentation. I want to let people know that I'm actually joining today from the beautiful downtown community of Pakenham. It's a small rural community, about 500 students. I am rural. We're located about 65 kilometers west of Ottawa. And I'd like to also acknowledge that it is located on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. So next slide. There we go. Today, I'm going to give an overview of how regional and rural economic development efforts are implemented across the Government of Canada and highlight some of the examples of our work that exemplify the importance of using an integrated approach to place-based rural development. Next slide. Here we go. I want to start off before I get too far along, just talking a little bit, providing a brief snapshot of what is rural Canada so people understand what we're talking about. Rural, remote, coastal, and northern regions account for over 4,000 diverse non-metropolitan communities. That's over a quarter of Canada's population, and they contribute collectively about 25% of Canada's gross domestic product. Rural accounts also for 90% of Canada's landmass. To put that in perspective, for those that haven't visited our great country, rural Canada is spread across almost 9 million square kilometers of land, signaling the importance of transportation infrastructure and efficient supply chains. Roughly 60% of Canadian municipalities have fewer than 5 staff. And this is predominantly, of course, in the smallest of rural communities, about 2,500 of them, in fact. In 2021, only 67% of rural households had access to high-speed internet. And we heard a little bit about that in our first presentation. That compared to 99.4% of urban centers. So an obvious inequality that was going on. We've worked to address that, but I can get to that after. Although the major rural outputs that help fuel Canada's economy are agriculture, forestry, mining, aquaculture, gas and oil extraction, and electrical energy, 60% of rural community employment is actually in wholesale, retail, healthcare, manufacturing, construction, and education, basically supporting the industries around them and representing a dichotomy that exists even within rural Canada itself. Tourism, by the way, provides about 10% of local jobs in rural non-metropolitan areas. Given the interconnectedness of urban and rural economic and social ecosystems, it's crucial that we make sure that rural Canada is sustainable and flourishing on an ongoing basis, basically to assure our quality of life here in Canada. Next slide, please. Why an integrated approach? Why it's essential? Well, essentially in 2019, a nationwide consultation was held with rural stakeholders. And I saw in the chat someone saying, hey, you need to start with rural Canada, talking to them first. We did that. It revealed that the government programs were not working for rural Canada and that a holistic approach was needed to address rural challenges. Because various contributions to growth potential are spread across many federal departments, we heard that the timing and the focus of our national programs did not align with rural needs and were often not complementary enough to address the entirety of the challenges that were being faced. For example, if you want to attract private investment to a rural community, you need investments in broadband, housing, water and wastewater, labor and skills, healthcare, roads. All of these things are required to create the right conditions for growth. There was a view that communities' realities were not being reflected and that small communities had to compete against much larger urban centers with significant dedicated community planning departments. They just couldn't. Many rural communities only had 1 to 3 staff managing all aspects of running a rural community. I mean, you think garbage collection of taxes, planning approvals, all of these things, all by these 1 or 3 to 3 people, and some of them, in some instances, were actually volunteers. Programs that did not include, or they did include rural definitions, but they were all inconsistent. They often focused only on population size and did not include remoteness considerations. As well, under Canada's Constitution, various roles and responsibilities were divided amongst both departments and other orders of government, which I'll talk to again in later slides. And finally, in many instances, rural communities and regions are dependent on single industries. Economic shocks and disruptions could be devastating to that rural economy, and the infrastructure and skilled labor of one industry were not necessarily transferable to replacement industries. This becomes even more important in times of high technological change and transformation, which we all know we're currently in. Next slide, please. So based on that, we have to go to a place-based approach. In Canada, we're pursuing that to all of our policy development and program delivery in order to take into account the local needs and challenges of Canada's diverse regions, including our many rural communities across the country. A place-based approach contributes to the advancement of national goals, such as strengthening domestic supply chains, promoting international economic competitiveness, and mitigating the impacts of climate change, which again, we've heard other speakers talk to. It better enables governments to respond to unique regional realities in a nuanced and flexible manner, accounting for differences between regions, sector-specific challenges, and local economic drivers. It also equips the Government of Canada to be responsive to local issues, which are actually a little bit outside of their jurisdictional role, their needs, their circumstances, their opportunities, and helps build an economy that is inclusive and works for everybody. Finally, place-based policies not only adapt to local conditions, but also drive economic resilience and innovation, fostering sustainable development that is uniquely suited to each community's characteristics and needs. Our intent is to create more robust local communities capable of adapting to changes and challenges and to ensure their long-term stability, particularly given their contributions to our GDP. Next slide, please. So making the most of a place-based approach requires, as we've heard and seen in the chat, collaboration and coordination of the key players across the ecosystem. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about how each component contributes to creating the right conditions for growth. Canada is a federation of divisions with divisions of power, jurisdiction, and responsibilities for economic development being shared between the federal government, which is the national level, and subnational governments, provincial, territorial, municipal, and Indigenous governments. The private sector, academia, and non-governmental organizations also play integral roles. At the federal level, no single department or organization is responsible for the entirety of economic development, very similar to what we heard in the US. And the governments regional agenda implicates a broad range of federal ministers with diverse mandates. Even within our own department, I'm in Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada. This includes several ministers. There are also ministers overseeing departments with strong sectoral mandates, such as Natural Resources Canada, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, as well as those with topic-focused mandates, such as Environment and Climate Change Canada, Employment and Social Development Canada, Housing, Core Communities and Infrastructure Canada, and others, such as Health Canada, which was referred to a little earlier. Canada's 7 regional development agencies are overseen by 6 separate ministers. And external to the federal government, there are corresponding ministers in each province and territory, and many partners and stakeholders that work collaboratively to drive place-based solutions for the achievement of national and regional goals, including what we call here community futures organizations, which help communities to advance their planning and development. Next slide, please. It's therefore a highly shared and integrated responsibility to advance economic development across Canada. On slide 7, which is in front of you, I've outlined the roles of some of the federal ministers as an example of how they overlap. I won't go into them, they're all there. Next slide, please. A key program delivery agent that is worth highlighting, however, are the 7 regional development agencies. And here you see how they're spread across Canada to really take into account the regional nature of their work. Through the RDAs, the Government of Canada can help ensure regions are well positioned to optimize their economic potential by establishing place-based approaches and actions. Next slide, please. So our regional development agencies play an increasingly important role in supporting horizontal policy issues. While whole-of-government approaches are needed to tackle major national issues, such as decarbonization, COVID-19 recovery, Indigenous reconciliation, there are benefits to those approaches being tailored to the unique needs of Canada's regions. RDAs do that. They're each responsible for promoting short and long-term job creation and economic development, particularly through the delivery of regionally tailored program services, knowledge, and expertise. RDAs are also credible antennas on the ground that help assess the impact of major initiatives on regional realities and optimize the design and implementation of both current and future programs and policies. We need that feedback loop in order to keep our programs representing what rural Canada needs. Next slide, please. There we go. That big consultation, what did it tell us? What we heard from rural Canadians in 2019 helped us move forward. The first dedicated Minister of Rural Economic Development was appointed in 2019, and that's what kicked off that national consultation. What we heard through that with rural Canadians was that broadband, and we heard it from others, was the #1 priority and an important enabler of economic development and technological innovation. Rural leaders also outlined several other challenges. The word map helps to show that, limiting their economic growth, including labor availability, skills development, availability of affordable housing, and access to federal programs. Other input covered a wide range of other topics, including the need for specific investments in tourism, resource development, community infrastructure, and resilience. Next slide, please. So how did the Government of Canada respond? To address what we heard during national consultation, the government developed a rural economic development strategy. And I'm going to have one of my colleagues actually put that into the chat. So if anybody wants to take a look at it afterwards, you're welcome to download it and read it. The strategy encourages us to recognize that rural economies thrive only when the community as a whole is doing well. To help bring rural realities to bear on rural needs, the Centre for Rural Economic Development, where I'm from, was created to work with other government departments and agencies to promote the unique needs of rural Canada in federal program and policy design. We wanted to initiate the integration of rural needs right at the outset of that development process. In recognition of broadband being the top priority of Canada, the strategy was released concurrently with the National Connectivity Strategy. It's called High Speed Access for All, Canada's Connectivity Strategy. Our commitment is that 100% of Canadians by 2030 will have access to high-speed broadband. We also work with Statistics Canada on a variety of rural data-related initiatives to improve the availability and accessibility of rural data through a Rural Canada Statistics portal, which I encourage everybody to visit. Again, I'm going to ask one of my colleagues to place those things into the chat function for people to go and look at. Next slide, please. So a little bit about Canada's Rural Economic Development Strategy. The strategy acknowledged right at the outset the horizontal nature of helping rural economies diversify and grow. For example, that means it recognized the need for adequate infrastructure to enable new business ventures, such as transit links to neighboring communities and sufficient housing supply to accommodate growth, or good quality of life and access to public services, community services, to attract workers and newcomers, local training opportunities to support upskilling, and supports for small businesses and local entrepreneurs. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate you putting those in the chat function. As most of these strategies initiatives are under the authority of different ministers, collaboration across other federal departments and agencies was essential to ensure that each initiative, independent of for each department, would deliver their desired results. The Center for Rural Economic, next slide, please. There we are. The Center for Rural Economic Development has become a focal center for rural economic development policy across the Government of Canada. The center's approach involves collaborating with actors internal and external to government, including rural stakeholders themselves, rural leaders, to connect and build knowledge about rural Canada, to mobilize this knowledge to actionable advice, and to assess progress in advancing economic and social development in rural Canada. A key part of this is mobilizing a wide variety of data and evidence, which we just heard about in Betty Ann's comments. Next slide, please. CENRED actively engages rural stakeholders and partners on an ongoing basis. We do that to ensure that we're aware of emerging challenges and opportunities, and that our advice to other federal departments and partners and recommendations correctly reflect what rural communities are experiencing. There we go. This includes working with Indigenous partners, national academic networks, such as the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation, as well as various national, provincial, territorial, municipal, and industry sector associations. Another important part of CENRED's work is building local networks to bring rural partners together, a convening capacity, and also we use that for a pathfinding service. Next slide, please. So to advance the rural economic development strategy, the center is focused on encouraging the consideration of rural realities in all new government initiatives and developing guidance tools to help federal institutions understand rural considerations. To this end, we're conducting targeted outreach to other government departments on rural priority issues. So we hear from rural communities that if that's a particular issue, we go out to the responsible department and we start building that relationship that we heard from Lighthouse as being an important piece. We also act as a challenge function to ensure that rural best practices have been integrated into new proposals. And I'll give you a little bit of tips on that one in one of our future slides here. I've listed a number of files that we've worked on in collaboration with other lead departments, which really gives you an idea of the need to work across governments. On slide 18, we won't go to it right now, I have correspondingly referenced numerous federal programs that have been structured to better account or to directly address the needs, challenges, and opportunities in rural Canada through the application of what we provide as a rural lens, that review to take into account rural realities. Next slide, please. To better coordinate with other orders of government, our minister convened ministers responsible for rural economic development, national Indigenous organization representatives, and expert speakers from government and private sector for Canada's first FPT meeting focused exclusively on rural economic development. That was back in 2023. The event provided the opportunity to share perspectives on rural development, hear about success stories and lessons learned, and deepen a shared understanding on the diversity of Canada's rural communities, as well as their unique needs, challenges, aspirations, and opportunities. In 2024, building on its success, a second FPT meeting was held, and planning is underway now for a third FPT meeting in 2025. And by the way, we hold those meetings in rural communities. If we want to support them, we're going to build our drawing capacity to those communities as well. Next slide, please. 17. There we go. So rural communities are diverse and have unique aspirations and challenges that need to be appropriately addressed. Keeping place-based principles in mind will help them thrive. We've compiled for you on this slide some key rural-friendly policy and program design elements. For example, pursue ongoing targeted and proactive engagement. Integrate purpose-built delivery mechanisms, such as a rural carve-out, so dedicated funding just for rural. That way they're not competing with the big urban centers. Ensure responsive implementation of programs that can be adjusted as needed during that implementation lifecycle. Dedicate resources to addressing specific rural challenges. And then finally, help rural stakeholders to identify and apply for the programs and services that were designed to meet their needs. That's a Pathfinder service that we provide. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through this slide, but as you can see, we've had some success. I've shared it as early examples of our success from a whole of government integrated approach to rural economic development. If you'd like to, you can go through the Government of Canada website and you can explore some of the details of each of these programs and see how we've basically addressed some of the concerns of rural Canada. And I've listed how those programs were specifically geared towards rural Canada, just to give you some ideas. Next slide, please. Here it is. Thank you for your attention, and I'm going to welcome any questions and comments that you have in the chat function. Just letting you know, I have two of my policy advisors online. Chris McDonald and Sarah Minez will assist me in responding so that we can make sure that we get back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. And please ask questions in the chat. And if we can't answer them now, we'll certainly get back to you. I wanted to bring in right away Antonia, because she provides another perspective from Finland and the Rural Policy Council and the great work that they are doing to kind of take an integrated approach to rural development in Finland. Antonia, I'm going to apologize in advance if I ask you to take 10 minutes.
It's okay. Can you hear my voice now? Because we could get our, yeah, good. Excellent. Okay. Hello, everyone. Antonia Huusberg from Finland, Ministerial Advisor from the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry of Finland, Secretary General of the Rural Policy Council. I'm going to keep it really short. I was invited to speak about the Rural Policy Council, so I'm going to have maybe like the process perspective on rural proofing and just what is the Rural Policy Council, what do we do, and hopefully it'll open up perspectives on, okay, actually everything is rural proofing in my mind. But okay, so I'm looking at it also as a process, but we can go forward to the next slide, please, and to the next slide. Just jump forward. Yeah, just a really short Paul's the first slide on Canada's ruralities was excellent, and I have a bit of the same here. Very rural country. 95% of Finland's surface area is rural, 68% sparsely populated. Here's additional numbers. Multi-local or multi-locality is something that is really specific, not maybe just for Finland, but also for Sweden and other OECD countries as well. But over half of our population lives part-time in rural areas and specifically sparsely populated areas. And approximately 40% of our businesses are located in rural areas. But let's go to the next slide. I'm not going to go into all of these, but this is just, we've heard a lot about data, disaggregated data, geospatial data. This is something that we do. We collect, we analyze. How do the policies play out? What is the situation in rural areas? What is the long-term development? And we also, of course, try and look to the future. Some interesting points that are on the agenda right now is the round things at the top left. We've looked at the government's public spending, and 75% of the state's budget and how it is allocated to different areas, to urban and rural areas. And this is really interesting also from a rural proofing perspective. So we've actually kind of rural proofed the national public spending from this point of view. And what's really interesting is that it's allocated like there's different yeah, it is allocated in a very different way. So if we look at rural areas, there's a lot less of public funding going to education and to when it comes to innovation, R&D, research and development funding. These are directed towards cities, while, for instance, benefits, social benefits are emphasized in rural municipalities. And this gives a new perspective on how really the national funding supports renewal in urban areas, while there's kind of an upkeep of or maintenance of rural municipalities. This is really interesting. This is the purple area of those donuts. And what's significant is that the funding from the Rural Development Fund is crucial for renewing of the rural areas, even though the Rural Development Fund and the funds that go to like rural developments outside of agriculture only account for 7.2% of the total CAP strategic plan in Finland, but it is absolutely crucial. And here's a lot of different maps when it comes to accessibility, when it comes to well, for instance, housing and everything. But let's skip. This is a lot of interesting maps and data that we're collecting, and that helps us in analyzing the situation in rural areas. But let's go forward. This is something that we do all the time. But what is the Rural Policy Council and our core network? The Rural Policy Council is an independent body that is appointed by the government for 4 years. And any election won't, how do you say, or the operations of the Rural Policy Council are not affected by results of parliamentary elections or changes in government, because it's established so that it extends beyond the government terms. So this gives a longevity to our work. The Rural Policy Council is chaired by the Minister of Agriculture and Forestry and is vice chaired by the Minister of Employment. It's not only cross-administrative, it is also cross-sectoral. But it only assembles 4 times per year. So we've got, together we have about 8 hours per year, and this is not a lot. So it needs this large network that operates all the time, that really implements the rural policy. So we've got thematic networks that work with employment, entrepreneurship, innovation questions, that work with housing and questions that pertain to people that want to move into rural areas, and there are a lot of different questions that are on the table right now. For instance, also when it comes to viable green green and digital transition that is like okay for all areas. Also small villages in sparsely populated areas. These thematic networks are large in themselves. And for instance, we have one of the networks, Kera, is coordinating a national sustainability week because some years ago we realized that, okay, when it comes to the sustainable development goals, we have the aggregated data, and all focus is on national data. And what does that mean? Like all the work that is done on a local level, it's just kind of missing in the data. So with the sustainability week, we actually really make that work visible for everyone, and almost all of the regions with different stakeholders is participating in the sustainability week. So we've got this thematic work that we do all the time, but these thematic networks, they change. We fund them for about 2 to 3 years, and then we get new thematic networks. But there is a longevity because there aren't that big of changes in the thematic work. The rural parliament and rural dialogues, we have, we only just finished or had our third rural parliament with over 1,000 participants, over 60 stakeholders, and in Northern Karelia. It was excellent. But this is a really, really important like participative democracy like process in itself. And it's important for the rural policy because we get to hear and listen to the people and the stakeholders, and we make changes to the rural policy that we make. But also we bring, there's the declaration, the National Rural Policy Declaration, which we also bring to the political parties and parliamentarians. What else? Rural research and development. I already touched that point. That is really, really important. Without rural research and development, I don't think that we can have a functioning rural policy or rural policy council. Absolutely. Yeah, it's one of the core main things. But we have less funding now than before, so we fund about 4 to 6 research and development projects per year. But these are really, really important. We get peer-reviewed articles, policy recommendation, and it also helps us with the rural proofing. Our working groups, for instance, the community-led local development working group is really important. That's together with urban policy. And these different working groups are also, well, maybe not touching rural proofing in itself. So we don't have a rural proofing working group, but the Rural Policy Council, the Secretariat, the thematic networks, the Rural Parliament, these and the research and development that touches more on rural proofing in a process that is evolving all the time. We've got the Secretary General, which is me, but also Vice Secretary Generals from the civil society, from research, and from other ministries. The members are extremely important in the Rural Policy Council. 40 members, 8 ministries, regions, municipalities, regional authorities, but different entrepreneurship organizations, civil society organizations, research and development organizations. So everyone is coming together in a dialogue to create more understanding. And Betty Ann touched the point of delivering information, and what we see as like crucial is the joint processing of that information. What does it mean? So we need time to process the information together in order to be able to rural proof and really get more knowledge in what different policies mean. And then the Secretariat, it's really important. The National CAP Network is represented in the Secretariat, well, also in the Rural Policy Council, indirect. Extremely important to have the connection between National Rural Policy and the CAP Rural Development Network. But within the Rural Policy Council, we work with something that we call broad rural policy, cross-administrative, big pictures. Narrow rural policies, for instance, the CAP EAFRD funding, CAP strategic plan, EU-funded rural development. And what is really crucial is that it is broadly used. We use it in a really broad fashion in Finland. And that is extremely important, but that's one of the main tools. We've got other tools that we can use, but that connection is extremely important. Okay, probably a lot of questions, but this is kind of, this is what it kind of looks like, the Rural Policy Council. But let's go to the next slide. We've got 6 main tasks. And actually, I think that all of these tasks involve rural proofing in some way or form. You can have a look at these, but these are the government-appointed tasks. So this is what we focus on, and of course, these are large tasks. Let's go to the next slide. My time is up, I think. But so rural proofing is at the core of much of our work, of our daily work. And rural proofing has been developed for a long time for the municipal and regional level use. But recently, the focus has been on developing the methods, really raising awareness through dialogues, through raising awareness and getting people together to really focus on what does this mean. And there is a growing interest for these issues. Maybe the COVID pandemic, maybe Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, a lot of questions, but there's a lot of interest and also a need for rural proofing that has awakened in other governments, not governments, but government departments, ministries. So what we try to do is make it easy, because as Betty Ann pointed out, government officials are overworked. So we need to make it interesting, we need to make it easy, and that's what we're working on, to have a good data, to have people that spar with government officials, to have these dialogues and a really, process the information. What does this mean for all of us? Now we're working on the government report, the 3rd government rural policy report, and we had bilateral dialogues with all other ministries, and there's over 50 government legislation projects or strategies, programs that we identify that are all connected within this rural policy. Next slide. Yeah, this is just a timeline. You can check this later. I think if you've got any questions, I'll be happy to answer in the chat. But this is kind of it's a process that we work with and on all the time, every day, I think, with everything we do. And also when the Rural Policy Council convenes, we have these hearings, we discuss, and the question is always, what is the Rural Policy Council's take on how this issue, this legislative preparation, how will it work? What are the questions that need to be addressed when it comes to rural proofing? So it's kind of in the meetings also. Okay, thanks. That's everything
Thank
for
you
me.
so much, Antonia. I think you have a lot of questions already in the chat, and I know we're at time, but I don't ask your indulgence because I do want to bring Joanne Caddy in, who is my colleague from Gov, who brings a different perspective to everything. And I've asked her to kind of listen in and to kind of provide kind of her takeaways in addition to bring in some of her research on this effort. Joanne, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Betty Ann, and thank you for this opportunity to listen and to learn. I'm going to be really swift, so if we can go to the next slide immediately. I just want to put this in a slightly different context, which is the OECD's work on our Reinforcing Democracy initiative, and I'd like to focus in on the second pillar of that work, which is all about enhancing representation and citizen participation. I'd also, in the next slide, like to share with you some important data. We're all about data at the OECD, as you know, but a very important piece of work which has been released earlier this year. It's a second edition of our OECD survey of drivers of trust in public institutions. This is very important. You've all touched upon different aspects of trust and voice and participation, but basically it's rather sobering news that across the 30 OECD countries that participated in 2023, 44% of the respondents have low or no trust in their national government, outweighing the 39% who have high or moderately high trust. So there is definitely a trust deficit. More significantly, only 37% believe that government will be fair in balancing the interests of different generations. And over half, and this is very significant, 53% of the respondents believe that the political system does not allow people like them to have a say. And having a say, and people's belief that they have a say in what local government or national government does, is actually very crucial for trust. Indeed, the biggest trust gap is not between demographic, socioeconomic backgrounds, high, low educated. The biggest gap of 47% is between those who think they have no say in what government does at 22%, and those that have say, of which 69% trust government. And so this is very important for the discussion about inclusivity that we're having here. Next slide. This next slide, it's a bit complicated, but the basic message is that citizens' experience of the day-to-day interactions with public institutions are important drivers of trust in government, particularly trust in the civil service. So that top arrow is telling us that, yes, it's important to continue to provide the services that actually make an impact on people's lives, and that issues like being treated fairly in a public administration when accessing service is very important to trust. But, and this is very important for the complexity of the matters that you've been dealing with here today, trust in government is also very significantly impacted about people's trust in government's decision-making on complex policy issues. Okay, and this is the part where government falls down. And we can see that, for example, I've just highlighted 3 drivers. These are drivers of people's trust in national government. The 3 that I highlighted, that little green box, we have government, the belief that government balances intergenerational interests, the belief that government bases its actions on the best available evidence for decision-making, and importantly, as I mentioned, political voice. This is also reflected at the local government level. And I think that's why it was really great to see Delphine using this trust data in our colleagues' work that are working on regional and rural development. So next slide, please. I just wanted to cite, as it were, a Finnish minister. This is not on purpose. I didn't know that Antonio would be putting out the rural policy, but we had a very important contribution from the Minister of Local and Regional Government from Finland. And she said in one of her pieces she gave to a paper that we're publishing soon, it is very difficult to trust something or someone you cannot understand. If you cannot understand, it's difficult to have a voice. And this is important because the Public Governance Directorate's work on citizen participation is many, many decades in the making. But it really is all about the definition of how citizens can have voice and have impact. And I was very interested to hear, these different examples of the listening function. Paul was talking about the antennas that are represented by the regional development councils. And so Antonio was also talking about the rural parliaments. And it's extremely important. Maria was also talking about the importance of these distributed centers that are looking and listening and partnering. So this aspect of this work of listening is very important for the work we're talking about here. Next slide, please. Very briefly, this is in a paper we'll be publishing soon. It was done for a recent global forum we held in Milan, Italy, on building trust and reinforcing democracy. We'll put all the links after this webinar. But what's important about this diagram is quite simply that the citizen is at the heart of all of the pieces of the state, the four branches of executive, legislature, judiciary, and independent institutions, and at all stages of the policy cycle. It's a dynamic model, not a static model. And if you go to the next slide, this piece of work on exploring new frontiers of citizen participation starts from trying to map the challenges. And I think we've heard quite a lot about these challenges. So for me, it's been fantastic to listen to everyone. The first one is about a shared understanding. Do we have the same understanding as citizens about what the scope, purpose, and expected outcome will be of the participation opportunities that are put in front of me or the ones that I take for myself? So do we have a shared understanding about what this citizen participation is about? The second one is very important, and you've all mentioned it in many ways. Indeed, this is the whole point of this seminar on integrated approaches. Coordination across the branches of government or across different parts of the executive branch, indeed, means that while we have a proliferation of access to information, consultation, participation, deliberative assemblies, etc., we have a veritable plethora, and thank goodness this is a good thing. It's not a bad thing, it's a very good thing, but it does require coordination because from a citizen's perspective, it's very hard to know where I will be listened to and where I can have my impact. Third challenge is alignment, and here we're talking about the alignment between back office functions and front office functions. You will be familiar with this, you'll have your own examples, but we have invested as public administrations in the front office of interaction, interfacing with citizens. Have we really aligned our core back office functions of budgeting and regulatory development? And the last one is very important too, and that's the challenge of accountability. If I am a citizen and I have provided my inputs in the agenda setting stage of a rural policy, am I sure that I have actually been listened to? And part of the frustration comes from not being sure that there's been accountability for my input and whether this precious input that I have given my time to provide to various public actors, has it been handed on to the next stage of policy formulation? Is it informing decision-making? Will it be used in implementation? And will it be a criteria for the evaluation of the success of the policy? Next slide. All of this is already complicated enough at one level of governance. Let's try and imagine the citizens' problem from the citizens' perspective of a multi-governance approach to their participation at the rural level, the regional level, national, and indeed global. And here we should, and we have had it mentioned, climate change is the quintessential policy challenge. It fits into what I was talking about before about the inability of governments to tackle complex long-term policy challenges that undermines citizens' trust in government. Well, here we have an example of climate change is playing out in such a way that we will all be affected, but we will not be affected equally. And there will be vulnerable populations, many of whom in rural areas, but not only, who will be more affected. So how can they have a voice in the climate mitigation and adaptation discussions, not only at their local level where they live, but the national level, so climate plans, but also the COP29 that's on right now in Baku. Now, COP30 next year in Brazil will be very much about people and planet. And so that's very good. That will really be an example of citizen participation at global policymaking level. But I think the challenge of our age is try to navigate this and really see it from a citizen perspective. Last slide is really about identifying what we mean when we say new frontiers of citizen participation. And yes, we are going to have to experiment with new models and digital models. A lot of talk about how AI can both undermine trust in government through mis and disinformation, of course, but it's also true that AI also offers tools to help citizens navigate complexity, to reduce and provide assistance to all types of citizens to be able to participate. So the really key message I'd like to leave with everyone is truly putting citizens at the heart of policymaking. It is now an imperative. It's not a nice to have. And it's particularly crucial to adopt a targeted and strategic approach to the design of participatory processes, lowering barriers, ensuring inclusion. But I would also really emphasize the importance of raising capacity. It's not enough to lower barriers of access if we're not also investing in civil servants' capacity to do this work. It is new and novel work, but also citizens' capacity to effectively engage and participate. Last but not least, of course, measuring impact and accountability. So I just want to leave it there, but I want to thank Betty Ann for inviting me to learn so much from this community of practice. And I look forward to working more with you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who indulged us. I appreciate that you gave me 11 more minutes of your time than planned. This is the second in our series where I promise you we'll get the timing right. But I hope you found it informative. Our intent is to have these conversations. And if there are topics that you'd like me to cover, feel free to drop me a line and let me know what other topics you think would be relevant for more of a public, as like a public forum. The next subjects will be we'll focus on well-being and how to measure rural well-being. We really need to understand if rural is happy. We're going to have a few discussions around rural urban. The first one will focus on the agriculture side because we never do that. And I'll be inviting my agriculture colleagues to join that discourse. And then we're going to do something on disaster and foresight and climate change. But please feel free to send me suggestions. The conversations will be posted. So if you would like to hear more, just drop me a line. And in a few, give us a week, I'll send a note connecting you to the link. Thank you again for your time and looking forward to seeing you again. And again, I really hope that you found this discussion good for you. Bye-bye.
Bye.